Hello, Gary Stearman, and we welcome you to another edition of Prophecy in the News. Today we have a very special guest, the author of this book, The Math of Christ, Colonel Stephen M. Bauer. Be right back. Colonel Stephen M. Bauer, welcome to Prophecy in the News.
Thank you. Great to be here, Gary.
This book, The Math of Christ, we're going to be featuring here at Prophecy in the News for quite some time, and I think after you hear about what's in it, you're going to want to get your own copy. Steve Bauer, let me just call you Steve.
Please.
You can call me Gary, and we'll talk about this book, which I think is a great witnessing tool. I introduced you as Colonel a minute ago. Tell us about your military history, what brought you thus far in life. Where did you come from? How did you happen to write this book? And fill in our listeners a little bit on Colonel Bauer.
I was in ROTC at Texas A&M, and I was in the Army ROTC. When I graduated from A&M, I had a commission as a second lieutenant. So 1965, President Johnson was sending a lot of troops to Vietnam, and I wound up in the 1st Infantry Division in Vietnam.
Wow.
And I thought that when I survived that and came back and then went to the demilitarized zone of South Korea, I thought I would stay in the Army and make it a career. So in my 28 years in the service, I rose from second lieutenant to full colonel. During that time, I had the great privilege of serving 5 different presidents in the White House as a military social aide and then as a military aide for the last 2. And it was just a lucky opportunity for me to be in the right place at the right time to get selected for such an august assignment. I really enjoyed it tremendously. Met a lot of people, quite a few Christians, a lot of people who weren't Christians, and I just knew that there were a lot of people out there that are just too smart to believe in Christianity.
And you've met all types. Having served so long in Washington, we think of it as being more or less the creme de la creme of society in Washington, D.C., and of course that would attract all types of people.
We like to tell ourselves that, but I don't think that's really true. I wonder sometimes if we've sent some of the best people to Washington. What they've done to us lately, I'm not sure is in the best interest of certainly not in the best interest of Christianity. I'm not so sure it's in the best interest of what America was originally founded on, but that may change.
And let me just be honest and say that you've seen some highlights, but you've also seen the dark side. And in that history of yours, you have come to Christ. And let's turn to the things of the Lord, because this book, which you've written, The Math of Christ, tells me that you're serious about Christ, that you're in your own personal walk. You've thought about Christ a lot, and obviously you've thought about witnessing a lot, because I think this is one of the best witnessing tools I've ever seen. How did this come about?
Well, I think people, if they're not Christians already, as they get older, they tend to realize that at some point you're going to leave this earth, and what's going to happen. And you ought to think about Christ for the simple reason that you might leave the earth today. You just don't know that, so you better be ready. And the way to be ready is to know that you can spend eternity with God.
And the thing that hops out of these pages, as far as I'm concerned, is that there is a way to witness that literally proves that God is real, that He is who He says He is, that He has come through on His promises. And you have put this in the form of calculating odds. And I'm looking at page 28 of your book. 40 prophecies, documented and fulfilled. Now, you begin going through the Bible, and you pick prophecies, and you more or less calculate the odds of the fulfillment of each of those prophecies. Most of us don't think that way. I know I don't. I'm not really a mathematician. I'm a sort of verbal in the way I look at life, and I'm verbal in the way I interpret the Bible. But you have incorporated the odds or the chances of prophecies having been fulfilled.
Well, everybody has probably heard the stories of Jesus Christ's life. You've heard the stories of Bethlehem and the 3 wise men, supposedly 3, and all of those stories. You heard that from an early age. what a lot of people don't realize is that there are specific prophecies in the Old Testament that say those things are going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went through and I wondered to myself, particularly for my very smart friends that are too smart to accept Christianity all by itself, based purely on faith, why not look at the odds that those things happened by accident? Each one individually could have been an accident. It could have been the prophecy could have been a lucky guess. But to say that all 40 of those events happened by accident is a bit of a stretch, to say the very least, and that's what I point out in the book. You have to have mathematical odds, and I explain each prophecy individually and say what I think very conservative odds are that it happened by accident. And then at the end, you have to multiply the odds of one happening times the second one times the third one, all the way through the 40th prophecy, to find out what the odds are that all 40 of them happened by accident.
That's a lot of zeros.
Well, it actually comes out to a 1 with 136 zeros behind it.
Wow.
Now, that may sound like a very large number, and it is far larger than what everybody has realized. For example, a lottery ticket.
Okay.
Everybody's talking about the lottery lately.
Oh, it's in the news. Even as we make this program today, there's this Mega Millions lottery.
The chance of this ticket cost $1. The chance of this ticket being worth winning the lottery are 1 in about 200 million. Well, how much is 200 million? How many zeros are in 200 million?
A lot.
Well, not very many. Actually, when you consider...
Well, you know, you're right, compared with the odds we're talking about in the Bible.
8 zeros.
8 zeros.
One chance. It's only got 8 zeros. That's. But everybody knows that if you buy a ticket, and you probably shouldn't because you're not going to win.
Right.
You shouldn't buy the ticket because you're not going to win. The odds are just too long with only 8 zeros. Let's say, for example, in putting the Bible in the context of your own life, what if your great-great-great-grandfather had said you would be born, you would be given the name you were given, you would win that lottery, and you'd be struck by lightning? All at this, this is going to happen all at the same time. Well, they would have locked somebody up that said that.
Sure.
They might, back 150 years ago, they might have put him out in the woodshed or something more merciful than that. But the odds are so long of something like that happening. But really, it's only got, if you use the math using the National Science Foundation would tell you what your odds are being struck by lightning. If you take all the zeros and add it together, it's only got 13 or 14 zeros behind it. That is so long. It is so much greater than the odds of winning the lottery that you wouldn't even think for a second that that could happen. The odds of these 40 prophecies coming to pass by accident are 1 with 136 zeros behind it. A number so long you couldn't even begin to try and write it out.
Tell me again, how many zeros?
136 zeros.
And there's no name for a number like that.
One of the things I point out in the book, a pinhead can have 5 million atoms on it.
Okay.
The human body has enough atoms in it that if you wrote the number out, it would have 21 zeros. The earth that we live on, only has enough atoms to have 50 zeros behind it.
Amazing.
The entire known universe that we see with the Hubble telescope, the stars, the moons, the asteroids, everything out there, every atom in the known universe, 1 times 81 zeros. Now, what's the context of examining these prophecies with all these zeros behind it? Well, there is a man who is known as the father of mathematical probability, a fellow named Emil Borel, a Frenchman who died in 1956. He formulated what's known as the law of mathematical probability, and it says any event that has 50 zeros behind it could not happen by accident. He is a mathematician, a scientist, And he said that it simply wouldn't be, no matter how many times you tried it, it would never happen by accident. The odds of something 10 times larger is only one more zero. It would only be 51 zeros.
51.
The odds of these 40 events happening by accident to Christ. 1 with 136 zeros behind it. Any smart person, any person that's too smart to accept Christ based on faith, would read this book and draw their own conclusion that it couldn't be an accident. Every child who's in school, faced with science and the theories of science that are thrown out as laws today in all the public schools, could look at this and say, I don't know if I want to buy that science, but I can buy the science and the math that's in the math of Christ.
And you have 40 examples in this book. Again, we're talking about The Math of Christ by Stephen M. Bauer. And we're very fortunate to have Steve with us today. Let's talk about an example of your thinking here. Let's just pick an example and use one of these Bible prophecies to illustrate how you come up with these numbers.
Happy to. Genesis 49:10. The Messiah would come from the tribe of Judah.
Okay. I think we're all familiar with that one.
And most Christians know that the Bible talks about 12 tribes of Israel. There are actually 14, you know that. They use the names at different times, different names, so there's a total of 14. I said the odds are 1 chance in 10. I want to be conservative, and 1 chance in 14 just confuses things. That's only 1 0. Another example.
Okay.
Micah 5:2. The Messiah would be born in the village called Bethlehem. I examined the population of the earth. About the time of Christ's birth was, most historians say, about 300 million people. An agricultural, agrarian society. Most people lived on farms or in very small villages. There were very, very few cities in the world. If you've got 300 million people, saying that there is an average of 1 million small towns around, could it have been an accident that they said that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem? Well, about 1 chance in 1 million. With 250, 300, 350 people in each village, 300 million people, that's simple math. Well, that's what we're talking about. It's only really got 6 zeros. Okay. So now we're only up to 7 zeros, and we've just talked about 2 of them. Another example, Hosea 11:1. The Son of God would be called out of Egypt in the early days of the nation of Israel. Well, first he had to go into Egypt.
That's true.
And he had to have a reason for that. That's not even part of the calculation. Just the fact that he was already there, and he would be there and then be called out of Egypt. What's the odds? I say it's just 1 chance in 1 million. Truthfully, you might think that the odds are greater. And in every one of the examples, the 40 examples I use in the Bible, you might think that you really want more zeros. You might think that the odds aren't as long as I think they are. You might want to have less zeros. My odds, my conservative approach to assigning odds to all of these events comes up to 136 zeros.
Wow. Now, while you're talking, it occurred to me that when you witness to people in the 21st century, we're talking to kids who've come up through the grades. They have come up through American high school and a little college and maybe a lot of college. But every one of their teachers proceeds on the basis that there are scientific truths about life, and we've got to teach the scientific truths. And what they teach is, of course, the scientific truth of evolution, both social and biological evolution, and they proceed on the basis of odds. You know, the odds are that such and such an animal evolved into another kind of animal based upon an existing number of years and based upon certain conditions you find in nature. So kids today are accustomed to thinking in terms of probabilities, the odds that a certain thing will happen at a certain time. And it strikes me as you're talking, this book is aimed at that kind of a mentality. People who are doubters usually are doubters on a mathematical basis.
They want to assign what they consider truth to what is a scientific theory.
Yeah.
And they
Absolutely.
take theory and turn it on its head, and they call it truth because that's what they want to believe. They would like to think that all of those things happened the way they said they did, and that there's no dispute. I say that there is tremendous dispute about what the scientists say about the history of the earth, the history of evolution, which has no real basis.
And you know, you can approach someone, and I have my Bible here open to Micah chapter 5, verse 2, but thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me, that is to be the ruler of Israel. We talked about that a moment ago. Some people might say, well, you know, that was written after the fact, and after Jesus had already, completed the work that he had to do, and so this is kind of like a forgery. And can you really believe that there were that kind of prophecies that existed before Jesus came? And here we got a magnificent gotcha, because historically, Judaism has a record of preserving ancient texts like no other culture in the history of the world.
Well, the accounts that show that Christ actually fulfilled these prophecies are eyewitness accounts.
They are.
They are accounts written by people who actually saw them there. Now, critics might say that Christ went out of his way to fulfill some of those prophecies. That is kind of a shaky argument, because Christ didn't decide to be born in Bethlehem.
That's true.
Christ didn't decide to be part of the tribe of Judah. He didn't decide at 2 years old that he was going to go to Egypt and then leave there. I mean, there are so many things in these prophecies that you can't argue that Christ contrived this. And when you consider that they may have been lucky guesses on the part of people who wrote 500, 700 centuries, years before Christ's time, that in fact they wouldn't really know that unless there was an all-seeing God who knew what the future was going to be and used the Bible to write the prophecy in the histories. And then when it came true, then it would simply authenticate. And that's the whole point of prophecy, is to authenticate the word of the Bible, so that we can see that everything that's written in there is true, because so much of it has already come true.
Before we sat down to do this program today, we were talking, Steve, and you said something that got my attention. Christianity, that is the Judeo-Christian history, is the only one in the world that really claims prophecy and the fulfillment of prophecy. All the others don't have such prophecies.
And that's pretty startling when you realize that there are so many billions of people living in this world,
yes,
living under a religious dogma that has no way to authenticate itself. Whereas Judaism, Christianity, authenticated itself simply because God told those authors what to write. We have proven that many of them have come true, so why not consider the rest of the prophecies about the end times and the things that will come that haven't yet? If the others are true, why aren't those true too? And the whole world needs to understand that it's the only religion that really describes the future.
Steve is a world traveler. He's visited cultures all over the world, and you've had the opportunity to talk with the people who are native to the East, various places, it would include China, Japan, Malaysia, Vietnam, places like that, and you've had an opportunity to kind of bat these ideas back and forth with the Eastern mentality. And you were telling me that when it comes to the idea of knowing the future, that's where Christians really stand out. I mean, the Eastern mind doesn't have this idea of a prophetic future like we do.
Well, they tell you how to live over there. Buddhism, Hinduism, it'll tell you how to have a great life on this earth. But it really doesn't tell you how to get into heaven, because heaven to them is kind of a Christian concept. It's something that they don't necessarily accept. I've had a lot of Buddhists tell me they acknowledge the fact that Buddha was born into a world. And I simply ask them as politely as I can, why not consider that somebody created that world that's obviously much greater than Buddha?
Mm-hmm.
And why not think about that entity and find out more about him? Why not find out more about Christianity? And they all accept that. That's a good starting point for somebody who is not a Christian to consider that there is somebody out there that did create the world.
And it's true that when we witness to people, one of our great witnesses is that our Lord is not arbitrary. He is part of the greatest plan in the universe. And that plan has details worked out long and long in advance. He fulfilled prophecy when he came. And there are other prophecies yet to be fulfilled. And if you put that all together, I don't know, you may have more than 136 zeros.
Oh, I think a lot more. And actually, in the book, I list 16 prophecies besides the 40 that I actually calculated odds on. Mm-hmm. I list 16 other prophecies, and I'll let the reader decide whether it's 1 chance in 10 or 100 or a million or whatever, and they can add zeros to the 136. If they don't like the calculation that I made, what I thought was very conservative, they can take zeros away from 136. But remember, the father of mathematical probability said if you've got 50 zeros, it can't be an accident. It has to be by design. There has to have been somebody, somehow, somewhere, that made sure that that outcome came out the way you said it would be. It wouldn't happen by coincidence.
Well, I remember Crick and Watson, the discoverers of human DNA, and I've always been impressed by their story. Because when they discovered DNA, after a few years they began to discover it was enormously complex. Enormously complex, on the order that we're talking about here, 136 zeros. And Watson and Crick were both atheists. And this became a problem for them because after a while they decided, this DNA strand could not have been accidental. It just has, there are too many variables here to have been accidental. Now, did they become Christians? No, actually they then hypothesized that there must have been some master race out there in space that sent DNA to planet Earth where it took root and it grew up and it evolved into human beings. They couldn't bring themselves to admit that there was a creator God. And I just wish I could have talked to Watson and Crick with this book in my hand.
Well, that sounds like a lot of school teachers who go out and profess that science is truth, and they twist theories to make them truth. And that's what those two gentlemen apparently did. They twisted their theory to make it truth for them so that they didn't have to suffer the rules of Christians that would get you to heaven.
Here on page 133 in your book, there's a chapter titled, The Message for You. And I quote, "You must decide for yourself if this was an accident of time, that all these 40 events happened by chance." In other words, after you read about the 40 events, it's your decision. And eventually, it'll become everybody's decision because sooner or later, every man is going to have to stand up before the Creator.
And we hope it's sooner because you just don't know what tomorrow will bring.
You don't. We're coming down close to the end of our time. What in particular really struck you while you were putting this book together? That is, what's the most persuasive thing you came across?
Well, aside from the obvious fact that the odds are so long that Christ is the Messiah, that's not by accident, but by design of God the Father, I was somewhat surprised by the amount of science that is actually specified in the Bible. The Bible talks in certain places about the earth being round, and I describe in the book how it says that.
Oh, yeah.
It talks about crop rotation. There's discussion in the Bible about circumcision, where in Genesis the Jewish people were told to circumcise their children on the 8th day. Well, it was only recently that science discovered that there is a chemical in the body called prothrombin that is produced in newborn babies, and it's at its height on, coincidentally, the 8th day. Is that a coincidence?
No, I don't
that
think
the
so.
Bible knew that back when Genesis was written? I mean, there's a whole section in here about the science like that I think that kids would find really interesting, particularly kids in school, about how the earth was designed for man, what's known as the anthropic principle, and that it wasn't just an accident, it was actually designed that way.
Well, we talked about that lottery ticket and all those zeros. As far as I know, the only way to win the lottery for sure is to have a time machine, go forward, check out the numbers, come back into the past, and write out those numbers on the ticket, or however you want to do it. Of course, you can't do that, but you can in the Bible. You can go back into the past. All the numbers were predicted, and we haven't seen the end of it yet, but we have seen the first fulfillment, the coming of the Son of God, and fulfilling all of those prophecies and creating that number with all of those zeros. And we haven't seen the best part yet, right?
There's one last lottery in life everybody ought to think about. One chance in 2. And I'll take those odds. You can believe in Christ or not.
Wow.
And you'll either spend eternity in heaven with God or you won't.
Steve Bauer, thanks for being on Prophecy in the News with us today. It's been fun. The book, The Math of Christ by Stephen M. Bauer. Gary Stearman reminding you to keep looking up. Prophecy in the News is a viewer-supported ministry sponsored by our many friends across America and in your area. For your gift of $10, you can receive a special edition of our current program on an audio CD, or for a gift of $20, we'll send you our programs on DVD videos. For either order, call the 800 number on your screen right now.